Welcome to our final session of Native Planting 101. I'm Amanda Newell. I'm with Cascadia Conservation District, and my colleague Kirk is on as well. You'll hear from him in a bit. We did want to just say a quick thank you to the Washington Department of Ecology. They're providing funding for our staff to coordinate this workshop. And then, of course, a huge thank you to our experts who've been presenting each week. So for anyone who's not familiar with Cascadia, we work here locally throughout Chelan County. We're non-regulatory, and our mission is to encourage wise stewardship and conservation of all natural resources. We're governed by a board of supervisors, and then we have a staff with all different specialties. And so we work with landowners and residents to meet whatever conservation need they have. And we have a lot of different cost share programs and technical assistance programs. So we always just really encourage folks to reach out to us and ask us your questions. And we probably have a program that can help you. And if we don't, we have a lot of really awesome partners that we would be happy to connect you with. So don't hesitate to reach out to us. And then part of what is so important about native plants, we just kind of wanted to touch on a few things. I know some of our speakers have already covered this, but maybe it's just a little review then. The native plants are adapted to our climate. We have those wet winters and dry summers. They require less water than the non-natives once you get them established, so in the long term. They are more resistant to the pests and diseases that we have in this area. And then they do improve water quality because they don't need to be fertilized as often. And the use of pesticides is not as much as if you were bringing in like an ornamental that is not native to our area. And then they also just save on resources and encourage a sense of stewardship when you use them. So thank you for your interest in being here through this series and learning about the use of native plants. So as I mentioned, Cascadia has a lot of different programs. So we'll just kind of go through them quickly. We have agriculture programs like irrigation efficiencies, soil health, and wildlife habitat. We have a couple of archaeologists on staff. We do a lot of community outreach and education. So things like this workshop. We also go to other community events around the area to promote just the programs that we offer, and we do print newsletters and brochures. We have a website and social media. And then we've really been trying to step up our bilingual outreach the last couple of years and have a couple of bilingual staff, which has been great. Wildfire preparedness and recovery is another big part of what we do. So we have cost share programs, home hardening programs. We do a roving chipper. We offer free yard waste disposal days, usually up in Chelan, but sometimes the other transfer stations participate as well. We've gotten more into prescribed fire and have been conducting learn and burns. So trainings for folks that are interested in either putting the fire on their property or helping, with some neighborhood cleanup or neighborhood project. And then we do post-fire restoration as well. And then kind of that stream aspect, we do habitat restoration and wetland restoration. We do a lot of native planting there along the streams, and then beaver dam analog installation. And then youth education is a big part of our programming as well. We try to hit students at all different levels of their education. So we have programs really through K through 12. We offer Wheat Week and after school program and summer camps for the elementary students. And then we have Kids in the Snow, Kids in the Forest, Kids in the Orchard for our middle school level, and then Kids in the Creek for high school. And then there's other programs that come out throughout the year, like you see those students helping put the weave on a beaver dam analog. So we like to get them involved in the actual restoration projects whenever we can as well. So like I said, don't hesitate to reach out to us about any questions you have, and we will either help you or help connect you to someone who can. And with that, I will turn it over to Kirk.
All right. Well, good evening, everyone. Tonight is the last of our virtual series, but we have an in-person workshop on May 10th from 3 to 5 in Fishafton. As you can see, it's limited to 25 people, and we're not advertising or anything. The only way to sign up is through attending one of the virtual sessions. I will drop that registration form into the chat just now. And it is a lottery. If we have more than 25 people, we'll just draw 25 names out of the hat. It's a really fun day. We've done it for the last several years, and the speakers are there, and we wander around, check out native plants, and they all give their opinions on the benefits and drawbacks of individual species of plants. So it's a lot of fun. But tonight we're really excited to have Al back. He has been joining us for 2 or 3 years now, maybe 4. He's a master gardener and a retired forester. He spent his 37-year career with the U.S. Forest Service and the Bureau of Land Management, worked across most of the western United States and also in Washington, D.C. He spent 20 years of his career with the National Fire Overhead Teams, and while working for BLM, he was at the National Interagency Fire Center and providing financial technical assistance to local communities. And he's received multiple awards, and his passion has really been assisting communities in reducing losses from wildland fires. He's literally written the local book on fire-wise plants through the Master Gardeners. So, Al, thanks again for joining us, and look forward to hearing your new presentation.
All right. Thank you, Kirk.
And there'll be several breaks in between, and so you can start jotting down your questions or put them in the chat. So.
Yes, in fact, I welcome the more chat we have. I think the better it is. The more I enjoy it. It's always a little challenging to talk on a Zoom program because you can't look at people and see their faces and see how they're reacting if they're saying, "Oh, BS," or "Yeah, that's interesting. Let's talk more about that." So I hope you throw out things and ask questions as we go through. So you see, I want to talk about vegetational threats tonight, and I'm willing to guess that I'll be talking about things that not all of us have thought a whole lot about. So what I want to do is I want to plant some seeds. I'm going to use some terms here that hopefully you catch on to. Plant some seeds, get them scarified, and then hopefully we can stratify those seeds and then get them maybe to germinate. Okay. And maybe even grow a few cotyledons here and there. Okay. Hopefully most of you followed that, right? So that's kind of what we want to do. And so my objectives are just discuss the different biomes, what I would consider biomes for north central Washington. And I'll define that term here in a second. And then we're going to talk about the vegetation within those biomes, okay? But the biggest thing what we want to talk about is the vegetational threats to those biomes, okay? And then we'll talk about some remedies with native plants. And Amanda already mentioned a couple things about native plants, but we'll get more into that. But the number one thing I want to do is make sure that you have fun, learn something, and don't get hurt. So don't fall out of your chair. And so the idea is to learn something, but have fun doing it as we go through this. So that's kind of the idea. And like I say, I welcome questions as we go through this. And I kind of want to define biome before we get started. It's a distinct biological unit of flowers, if you will, vegetation, and the animals that live in that area. Okay, the flora and fauna. Okay, so that's how we're kind of defining a biome. The other one I want to talk about is an invasive plant. And those are plants that are not native. They're non-native plants that can cause damage, if you will, both environmental, ecological damage, if you will, and in many cases, economic damage. So that's where we're going to start from. But I wanted to fire off with climate change. In fact, almost every presentation I'm giving these days, I want to start off with that because it's here and it's real. And a lot of us are not totally accepting that and looking at it from the standpoint of it's here. And I guess one of the things that I wanted to kind of point out is that, the difference between weather and climate. Weather changes daily, okay? And climate is something that changes over decades. But if you've noticed in the past couple of years, the climate is starting to act more like weather. It's starting to change much more rapidly, and we're getting greater fluctuations. For example, here, the biggest thing that I think is important to recognize when a lot of us in the past called it this is global warming, as a result of the carbon dioxide going from 200 parts per million up to what, 300-400 parts per million, and trapping the heat in. So people were calling it global warming. Well, I think that's kind of a dangerous term to call it because what it is, it's global extremes. Is extremes are happening. And as you can see, we got extremes in temperature, storms, and all those kind of different things. Uh, Today, I was listening to the news. South Korea is experiencing the largest wildland fires they've ever had in the history of the country of South Korea. I bet you don't hear South Korea as far as wildfires very often. I've never heard it. And I am attuned to that. I listen very carefully when somebody talks about wildfire because that's what I did well, all of my career. So, but I want to point out a couple of things that the averages may not change a lot, but the extremes are changing a bunch. I don't know if you remember just a couple of years ago, 2 or maybe 3 years ago, we had a temperature in Wenatchee of up around 120. Okay. It was just hotter than heck. And then what, less than 2 weeks later, we had a temperature that was down around 42. It still averages, over the winter, or excuse me, over the summer, not winter, summer is, we have temperatures in July, if you will, that normally range from about 70 degrees to 90 degrees. And so that's what, an average of 80. Well, if you look at that one above in the red, it's not much of a difference. It's averaging 81. Not much of a difference in averages, but look at the extremes. The amount of energy that is going into the atmosphere or staying in the atmosphere is absolutely phenomenal. It's really big. And so what happens, here's your physics lesson for the day. Energy moves from a high energy source to a low energy source, from a high pressure to a low pressure, high temperatures to cold temperature, and it moves. And when we have these drastic differences in temperature, that's when we get these drastic changes in the weather and we get really strange things going on. The reason I'm talking about this because I think it's important for the plants that we're looking at. Most of our plants that we have, the natives around here, are used to extremes. And it's interesting. We need to be looking at the plants not on the far extreme of one biome, if you will, or the other extreme, the dry extreme or the wet extreme, but we need to be looking at plants that have a great range of variability in their adaptiveness, if you will. And I just, look at the same thing with precipitation. We go from almost no precipitation to deluge of precipitation, 20 inches. And something that's important about that 20 inches of precipitation in a year versus the 8 to 12 inches. And I think our average in Wenatchee is right at 9. But when you get a deluge of rain, you get very little effective use of that rain, of that precipitation. What happens is the water comes down so quick and so rapidly that the ground gets saturated very, very fast and you get a lot of runoff. And so that causes a number of problems, but you don't get full effective use of that precipitation. It goes right on down to the Columbia River and down to the ocean. Okay. Not that that's not a bad use of the water, but it's just not as far as getting the ground saturated again. So let's talk about the different biomes that I'm going to talk about this evening. In the sage steppe, that's our grasslands. Almost all of Douglas County, if you will. the lower parts of the Wenatchee and down south. And we're going to talk about the dry forest, the ponderosa pine forest. Okay, and that's a little different. But we're going to talk about that. And the other one I'm going to throw in there, and I'm not sure, maybe some of you give me a hard time for calling the wildland urban interface a biome, but I think it's very important that we talk about that. And we're going to talk about the threats to each one of those different biomes, the threats from a biological standpoint and a vegetational standpoint. So the sage steppe has been in trouble for quite a while. It is, I think most of us know it's mostly sagebrush. That's why it's called a sage steppe, by the way. And the sagebrush is disappearing. In fact, over the range of sagebrush, there is almost like a 90% to 95% reduction in the amount of sagebrush over its entire range in the west. From about the 100th meridian west, to the Columbia River, it has really decreased for a variety of reasons. And what's coming in is at least in the wildland parts, is the biggest threat out there is annual grass. And that annual grass is cheatgrass. But we got some other things that are threatening it also. But the big threat is the annual grass, the cheatgrass is the number one threat, in my opinion. And by the way, you're hearing an opinion, okay? It's a professional opinion, and it's quite okay to have a difference of opinion, and we don't have to argue it over it, but we can respect each other. And if we have a different idea, that's great. In fact, that's wonderful to have a difference of opinion on what is what. But anyway, Russian thistle, knapweed, and I know there's other plants out there, but I'm going to concentrate on the cheatgrass here, but the knapweed, Russian thistle, I'm going to talk about it for a little bit. Tumbleweed, okay, we all know what tumbleweed is, and that's Russian thistle. Okay, here it is in the lower left, if you will, in a nice green state, and over here in the lower right, it's when it's all right out and tumble and gets hung up in place. Is one of the things about Russian thistle why it's such a threat. You ever think about how many seeds Russian thistle has per plant? I'll let you think about that for a second. But a large tumbleweed, a large Russian thistle, can have up to 200,000 seeds per plant. Okay. And I'm sure most of us have seen tumbleweed going, across the field, down the road or whatever. And you notice how it bounces. And about every time it bounces, it's dropping seed. Okay. The only good thing about this viability, how long a seed lasts, it's fairly short viability. They last 1 to 2 years. On the other hand, peatgrass up here in the upper left is it's got viability of up to about 7 years. Okay. Now I'm gonna skip lightly over knapweed for a variety of reasons, but there's a number of there's diffuse Russian and a whole variety of different knapweeds. So I'm not going to get into those too much, but it's another seed. It's a biennial for the most part. That means it flowers 1 year, and then the next. Well, I should start off. The first year it's kind of a rosette type of thing where it doesn't flower, and the next year it does flower. So it's a 2 year life cycle on that particular plant, and it is another one that's got a long viability of seed. So it takes a long time to get rid of that. It's not just a one and done. In fact, with all of these plants, it's not just a one and done. Um, so let's talk about the alternatives, if you will. Is the thing with the native grasses that can replace the cheatgrass? I'm going to back up. I'm going to back up here a little bit. The reason the annual grasses is a problem is because it is so easily to ignite and it burns so ferociously, and it burns, when I say ferociously, with a high energy release. It really burns the area and scorches it pretty good. Cheatgrass, if you've ever seen a fire of cheatgrass, it can produce an easy 20-foot flame length. A grass that's only 16 to 18 inches tall can produce a 20-foot flame length, which has got a tremendous amount of energy that it's putting both to the air and to the ground. So it's really causing a lot of damage. And what it does when you get an annual grass come into an area and takes over the from the perennials and, if you will, the perennial grasses and sage, the fire cycle is very, very frequent. In fact, with an annual uh, ecosystem, if you will, an annual grass ecosystem, the average fire-free frequency is anywhere from 5 to 10 years. And 5 to 10 years of burning every 5 to 10 years, it doesn't allow for any of the the shrubs to reestablish themselves. So they just get wiped out from the site. When you lose the shrubs, you're losing about 450 different animals that depend on the shrubs in that ecosystem. So you totally change the critters, if you will. That's a technical word. So you have a totally different ecosystem, and that it's something that is just energy in, energy out on a very rapid basis. It doesn't store up energy. It doesn't store up reserves. It doesn't build soil. It loses if you will, a lot of the nutrients in the soil because of so frequent burning. Whereas the native material, you got a much longer fire-free cycle, anywhere from 30 to maybe even 60 years, in some cases even higher. In nature, there's a great deal of variability. So if we can reintroduce those natural and native vegetation, the forbs and the shrubs, we got a much better chance of having a more stable, if you will, a nice stable ecosystem that is not subject to drastic changes. Um, okay, I hope that makes sense. So let's talk about some of the grasses, if you will. In the upper right there, we got Sandberg's bluegrass. It's one of my favorite grasses because it is probably one of the hardiest grasses that can grow on just miserable soils. It can take a lot of grazing, it can take a lot of use, and it comes back. And it is extremely hardy from a drought standpoint. From a uh, fire-wise standpoint, if you will, fire-resistant vegetation, it's an outstanding grass. It only gets about 6 to 8 inches tall. And in fact, one of the interesting things about that, when the plant is not stressed at all, very seldom does it put up seed heads. You know, over here on the right, you see the left, you see that this is Idaho fescue. It's a finer grass, a more fine blade. But you see, it puts up a lot of seed heads. It puts a lot of energy into that. Whereas Sandberg's bluegrass is one of those, it only puts up seed heads when it feels like it, when it's stressed, when it feels like it's going to be in trouble, then it puts up a lot of seed heads. But if it's not stressed, it doesn't waste its energy putting up, it puts it more into the vegetative material around. So here's two good grasses that are both nice and native, and they grow in a variety of different conditions. And they really stand a good chance of competing, if with a little help, competing against the annual grasses, the cheatgrass. There's a couple other grasses that grow on much more sandy type soils. Uh, the Sandbergs, like I say, grow just about in any type of soil, but these two grasses, needle and thread and Indian rice grass, are two grasses that do quite well on sandy soils, and they're both native to our area, and they're very drought tolerant. Here's a couple other grasses, prairie June grass and sand dropseed, which are interesting grasses. These are, again, bunch grasses that offer a good variety, if you will, and offer diversity for different critters. Um, Over here on the left, we got blue bunch wheatgrass, which is probably the most common bunch grass in the sage steppe. And it's a grass that was, in fact, an interesting article that I read not too long, well, actually it was a while ago, is the last pure stand of blue bunch wheatgrass disappeared from the western United States about 1900. Okay, can you imagine that? Is when I say pure, undisturbed, healthy stand of blue bunch wheatgrass. There's other grasses and, if you will, invasive species were introduced. Uh, Before 1900, there was a lot of continuous grazing across almost all of the dry forest and the sage steppe across the western United States. The land was open. It's not that people were malicious, but people would often get cows or sheep. I know of one example where they got their cows. They bought their cows in Southern California. I said cows, sheep. They bought their sheep in Southern California, drove them north over the range of the summer, the duration of the summer, and sold them in Shantico, Oregon. Okay, at that time, it was 1886. They sold their sheep. They bought them for 5 cents a head, and they sold them for 55 cents a head at the railhead. And during those days, they made a killing, if you will, made big money. And the family that did that started a ranch in that Central Oregon area and did well, and they still are ranching down there today. But the thing is, as soon as one person to drive their sheep across the area, and then unbeknownst to somebody else would come by with a herd of cows or whatever, or another flock of sheep. So there was a lot of unregulated grazing that transpired from about the 1870s up until about the early 1900s. And so a lot of the damage to the range and the dry forest was done at that time. And we'll talk about that a little bit more. But anyway, that's a kind of a side note, but the blue bunch wheatgrass and the basin wild rye. Basin wild rye over here on the right is one of those species that it can get up to 6 feet tall. Uh, both of these species, with just a drop of water, and I mean drip irrigation on these about once a week or so, they'll stay green throughout the entire fire season. And they're just beautiful plants, if you will, and they're native. And you see the sagebrush out here in the with the blue bunch wheatgrass and the forbs also. Here's a couple other grasses that are more tied to the riparian areas or to the dry forest. The pine grass and the variety of sedges. There's a lot of variety of sedges that are down close to the riparian areas. The riparian areas being the wet areas that generally stay wet year round. And these are a couple of natives that are very good in those areas. So now let's talk about some forbs. Forbs are annual and perennial flowers. I know the term forbs is not used commonly, but it's broadleaf plants, okay? Broadleaf herbaceous plants, plants that are not woody, okay? And they generally have a really high moisture content in them during the growing season. In fact, many of these plants, the forbs, have up to 400% moisture content. That means that if you take the weight of the plant, say the plant weighed, just pick an easy number, 1 ounce. If the plant weighed 1 ounce, it may have 450 ounces of moisture in it. So when that plant dries up, there's almost no material left. Okay. And that's one of the reasons these work out very well as a fire resistant plant around your home, up close to your home. So when they got moisture in them, they're non-flammable. And by the time, if they do dry out, they have very little plant material left so that it doesn't cause a severe fire when they do burn. Okay. And most of these are perennials, so they'll come back. Definition of a perennial is all above ground material dies annually, but it grows back the following season. Okay. So these are often, like I say, they're often the attractive attention grabbers, if you will, as we go through here. Now, just throw out a few of them. Is lupin, very common in our foothills, a really great plant. It puts down a root system that really grabs a hold of soil. It's a nitrogen fixer. It takes and changes the unavailable nitrogen for plant growth into available plant growth material, nitrates to nitrites, all that kind of good stuff. And they really are wonderful plant for building soil and keeping soil good and healthy. And penstemon, there must be about 30 different brands, if you will, species of penstemon. And for everybody's wants, needs, and desires, there's a penstemon that will meet your needs. Okay. Here's a couple of plants that I think are really nice and pretty. The strawberry over on the left side of the shot is a nice low growing plant. It only gets up a couple of inches. And the native strawberry it's got little strawberries. They're only about the size of your little finger if they produce them at all. But and they're absolutely wonderful. Columbine, again, is another. Aquilegia is, oh, doggone it, the scientific name for that. And it really produces a very, very pretty flower. And again, both of these, um, I've seen strawberries in the place of a lawn. They're not great for traffic, if you will, but if there's not a lot of traffic on the in that area, it works well instead of uh, Kentucky bluegrass. It doesn't take nearly the water and is quite hardy and serves a lot of purposes, unlike Kentucky bluegrass. Here's a couple other ones. Yarrow. Yarrow is a plant that probably is definitely one of those that you either love it or hate it. It seems like, and I've noticed that there's a lot of opinion on yarrow, and I know somebody that lives in this house with me that's not a fan of yarrow, but I'm a strong fan of yarrow. Is yarrow is one that it's got a medicine, it's got food, it can make a tea, it can do all kinds of great things. Okay, so it's a wonderful plant, and it's a plant with a, if you will, a great range of variability. It's called an increaser. Um, when when things get stressed out, when the grasses and what have you in the area get stressed out, overgrazed or whatever because of the amount of yarrow will increase. Okay, and then as things start to come back and they get more moist and the grasses start coming back, the yarrow will decrease in abundance. That is. Okay, so it's an increaser decreaser, and it can tell what the trend of the range area of the grassy vegetation is. Is the grass condition getting better? Well, if it's getting better, the yarrow decreases. And if it's going downhill, the yarrow increases. So it's an interesting plant. And it helps you read the environment, what's going on. Okay. So it's kind of a cool plant. Um, Fireweed and Clarkia, two species that are really interesting. Fireweed is a cool plant. It's when I say a cool plant, it's a very interesting plant. The reason it's interesting, it comes in following disturbances. Okay, a fire. Okay, that's one of the reasons why it's probably called fireweed. And it provides a lot of different foods, teas, and what have you. And if you look at the way it flowers, you can see my cursor here, is it's flowering down here. The flowers are down low. And as the season progresses, the flowers move up. And by the way, you don't need a calendar. All you need is some fireweed. Okay, because once the flowers are flowering up here, you got a couple of weeks until it's starting to snow. Okay, so there you go. You got your time machine right there to tell you what's going on. You can throw your calendar away and just plant fireweed everywhere and just keep an eye on it. Then you know when to cut firewood and when you need to start getting warm. Okay, you might keep your calendar just for the heck of it. Okay, a couple of other plants, scarlet gilia and bitterroot. Bitterroot is a plant that only gets just a couple of inches off the ground. A really neat plant. In the spring, the Native Americans used it as a food source. Okay, and then as it dried out and things moved towards the summer and later on, it became a medicine. So again, it's a plant with a great deal of versatility and viability throughout the season. Okay, it doesn't get very big, um, and it's a cool plant. In fact, it was a hanging offense, if you will, a few up until just a few years ago in Montana to pick a bitterroot. But you know what? The reason it was really made that a law was probably to reduce the Indians, the Native Americans used it a lot, and it was really probably a not a very good law. So I'll leave it there. Okay. Any questions on that so far? Anything in chat?
Yeah, so we got several questions, and still, if anybody else wants to add some, but generally was asking, saying when she was working as a tech for BLM, a rancher told her cheatgrass provides good forage for his cows. So what sort of agricultural use does it have?
Okay, you know that is true. Um, Cheatgrass provides good use for the cows. Now, if you've ever noticed, if you got a good moisture year, you got good cheatgrass. If you don't have a good moisture year, you have cheatgrass that may get up maybe 6 inches. When one has to run their business on something that is as variable as cheatgrass, and it's very, very dangerous, okay? And so you don't know from one year to the next year whether or not you're going to have adequate grazing to keep your herd. So it is really, really dangerous. And I would not want to run my business on an annual basis. So lots of ranchers have to run on an annual basis because that's all they've got on their range is cheatgrass. So I'm not suggesting that it's not a viable, when it's green, it's a very good uh, grazing grass. But as soon as it dries out, it's worthless. Okay. And how soon does cheatgrass dry out? Is probably by the 4th of July, it's gone. Okay. Have you noticed the foothills here in the Wenatchee area? You can watch cheatgrass. Cheatgrass is what is called a cool season grass. In fact, uh, when I say cool season grass, it starts growing, cheatgrass starts growing underneath the snow. It'll pop out and start to grow up, and it'll be, when the snow melts, it'll be about an inch tall. And by the way, the roots go down about that distance too. Even when it's a mature plant, the roots are only about an inch deep. So it's a cool season. As soon as the snow is gone, it starts to green up. So you need to get on the range right away if you're going to be using it for your livestock. And because it's going to be gone by the 1st of July and really not a viable grazing. Does that make sense?
And also, I got several other questions here. So, how do annual grasses lead to more frequent fire cycles?
Annual grasses definitely lead to more frequent fire
And how
cycles.
how do they do that?
Oh, how do they do it? They are easily ignitable. Okay, is what the issue is. Is if you will, the fuel out the grass is the fuel. It's the hazard. Now, what happens also is on the other side of that, an ignition is the risk that we are facing. Okay, so when you have a high hazard, any risk becomes much easier to start them on fire, and they move much more rapidly. Heatgrass is one of the few species where a fire moves just like a wall of water. In most other fuels, fire doesn't move like a wall of water. What it does, it moves out and then spots. It moves by spotting and then burns irregularly and burns patches, if you will, throughout the regime. So it burns much more intensely, much more thoroughly, and is easier to ignite. Okay.
Right.
Now, if
And
you remove the ignition probability, it doesn't cause more fires. But I think we all know that we can't manage the probability of ignition from fireworks or sparks or whatever, some type of chance. It just ignites much easier. Okay.
and can you prune the native grasses to ground level every couple year or two?
No, I would not. The Don't prune native grasses. Most of these native grasses are bunch grasses, and the if you prune them down to about 4 inches, okay, uh, you're great. Okay, that way you're not hurting the root crown, if you will. The root crown is where a lot of the carbohydrate reserves are right down in there at the ground level. Okay, so you got a lot of the bunch grasses, oh, maybe a foot in diameter, something to that effect. But you know what? The roots are probably out a yard. They're out 3 feet and they go down about 3 feet. So there's a tremendous amount of root mass underneath the ground that we don't see. And that's why when you walk through a bunch grass area, there's a lot of forbs between the grasses. The forbs cover those areas between the grasses. And let's see, am I getting at it? Yeah. So keep the if you will, the grazing height to about 4 inches, if you will, with your trimmer.
And
Okay.
Couple more. So, what are the characteristics of Clarkia and Gilia for native plantings?
For
The characteristics of Clarkia and Gilia for native plantings. I'm not quite sure
okay,
if I'm understand. Maybe you get what she's asking here.
okay. Well, both of those species grow in a great variety of soil types. Okay, they can grow well in a loamy soil. They probably don't grow as well in a heavy sand, if you will. They grow well in rocky soils. A lot of what we have in our basalt areas, if you will, they are great. They grow in those. And again, they only take a little bit of water to keep them green for most of the summer. Um, I'm not sure. Did I answer that?
I think so. And where can we get Bitterroot commercially?
Um, well, I would suggest to check with Derby Canyon Nursery to see if Mel has it.
Yeah,
I don't know.
yeah.
Um,
And
but
without using herbicide, how would you suggest transitioning a landscape full of cheatgrass into a more biodiverse and predominantly native plant landscape?
that's a challenge. That's a real challenge. Is you need to deal with the seed. Is now I'm a little bit nervous saying this, but prescribed fire is one outstanding way to deal with cheatgrass rather than an herbicide. And if you can't use prescribed fire, I would suggest an herbicide would be your second best alternative. So I'm not suggesting to go out there and light your cheatgrass on fire. Make sure you have somebody that's well trained in prescribed fire to do that before you go out and burn cheatgrass. But those are the thermal and mechanical does not work with cheatgrass. So you either got to use a chemical or thermal fire to deal with cheatgrass, and you need to deal with it for several years. Um, if you go out and plant, now you can pull cheatgrass. It's easy to pull. So if you go, if it's on a small scale, a yard type scale, if you got a fairly small yard, as the cheatgrass comes up, they are easy to pull out. And so you could plant, you know, Sandberg's bluegrass or blue bunch wheatgrass or any of those native grasses that I talked about. You can plant those out there either with seed or with a plug, if you will, a grown plug, and plant those out there. And then you can pull on a small scale. It's obviously it's got some backbreaking labor involved in that, but otherwise you have to use either a chemical or a fire. What
We've
else we
got
got?
some more, but it's 7:40. So, and you
Okay.
got two more biomes to go. So why don't we can come back to these questions if we have a chance.
Okay, we'll go through these a little quicker, and I
Okay.
didn't realize how slow I was going. Uh,
No worries.
okay, I want to talk about the ponderosa pine, the dry forest biome, if you will. It's all the area, if you will, west of us on Wenatchee and up on the forest. Um, those areas is you look at this slide here, a lot of people think these trees like this are all the same age. These trees are not the same age by any means. There could be a couple of 100 years difference in the age of these trees, anywhere from uh, 400 years down to less than 100 years old. Okay. So they may look the same, but they're not. This is very much an uneven age stand. And this is what got a lot of pine forest into trouble. Everybody thought this was all old growth. And it was the idea, just like a garden, right? You go out and pick the big vegetables and let the little ones grow. Well, that's not the way ponderosa pine forest developed over time. The ecological processes that was so key to ponderosa pine was fire. And fire would move through these forests at a very low intensity rate, maybe a 3 foot intensity or a 3 foot flame length, which is very low intensity. That's about 60 BTUs coming off. And so it doesn't scorch anything, but it kills all the small trees. So over time, what would happen, maybe one of these trees or two of these trees would fall down and break, and then the crown, for example, would burn, and it would burn hot, and it would leave a bare area where the seedlings would start and run, but that area wouldn't burn for several cycles, if you will, throughout there. So now you'd have these different smaller trees coming up, and but primarily it's all large trees. Okay, so let's look at some of the threats, if you will, to that. Is the biggest vegetational threat to ponderosa pine forest, in my opinion, is Douglas fir. Douglas fir is a species of tree. It's a short needle tree. It's a different subspecies than the tree over on the west side. Okay, this is a totally different tree that has totally different uh, growth requirements. The Douglas fir on the west side requires sunshine to start off with. Douglas fir on the east side requires shade for the most part. So as the area becomes more shaded, the Douglas fir will do quite well. And so the other threat is that these trees come in and they become dense. I'm going to show you some slides here in a minute. The other threat, it was the removal of the big trees. A lot of people early on thought, and rightfully so, is just like managing a garden. You harvest the big carrots and let the little carrots grow, right? But that removes the process, the ecological process that was so predominant here with fire. Fire visited these sites about every three to 30 years in an irregular cycle. So it was very important for fire to be part of this stand. So that's why the trees needed to be big. The bark of a ponderosa pine is very, very fire resistant and can withstand a lot of heat. So what started happening again was fire exclusion. Is we, as most European folks, thought that fire was a bad thing and it stopped the little trees from growing. So we started excluding fire. There was a specific policy that removed fire from the system. Okay, so the dry forest is a very sustainable, resilient system, yet it's fire prone because the trees, the characteristics of a mature ponderosa pine are very fire resistant. This is a sneak question here. How many ponderosa pines do you see in this picture? I see one, this one tree here. And this was probably a very ponderosa pine site like that picture I just showed you a couple of seconds ago. It was probably very identical to this. But what happens with fire exclusion and the removal of the big trees, the Doug fir come in and take advantage of the site. That's just the way Doug fir is. It's a species that comes in that takes opportunity of that particular site. And by the way, this site here is very non-fire resilient, fire resistant whatsoever. If a fire were to start in this area, it would burn with great ferocity and a high intensity, and it would be a stand replacement fire. So, so one of the things, I won't spend a lot of time on this, but I'll go through it kind of rapidly. Acres burned today are, listen carefully here, acres burned today, even with the big fires that have happened in the past several years, is a lot less than it used to be. Back in the old days, before we were here, the amount of acreage burned in the West was huge. Millions of acres burned, but at a very low intensity. The frequency was anywhere from about 3 to maybe 30 years, but on a kind of a reoccurring basis, whether it was started by lightning or by Native Americans. And the severity was very low. We did not have high intensity fires in our dry forest, okay? But as population increased, when we started building homes around in the different areas, then we started looking at fire exclusion, and that became something that fire became a bad, if you will. We assigned a value to fire, and fire was bad. And we didn't look at it as an ecological process. In nature, there's not good and there's not bad. It's just consequences, okay? But we assigned a value to it, and as the population increased, we needed to deal with the fire situation, and we decided that this is the way we do it by excluding fire and suppressing those fires that did start. The potential actions that we can do in a dry forest, we can thin it out more and we can include fire. We can start doing a lot more of fire inclusion by doing prescribed burning and managing fire throughout the forest. It has, like I say, it was always was part of the ecological process of these forests. Now it's gone, and everything in that process or in that system is going astray because of the exclusion of fire. So we can get them back to this particular manner. And then this may even be too thick for what the natural conditions were, but we can move back and get them into this condition. Then when a fire does start, it's not a threat to us as people, and it's not a threat to the forest or the wildlife. Okay. So now I want to move. Well, maybe I'll stop there and ask if there's questions. We got about 10 minutes left, and I don't think it'll take me much more than 10 minutes to go through the next one. Any questions on that?
I have to unmute. I don't see any yet. Mel jumped in and answered some of the previous questions that we missed. So,
Wonderful.
But yeah, so thanks, Mel.
Okay, we'll go through this real quick. This is now I'm talking about the urban wildland, the wildland urban interface. What I want to talk, this is where the woods, if you will, or the shrub steppe meets the development. Okay, where wildwood meets lumber. Okay. So one of the things that we want to look at is reducing the losses in there. And what I think is the biggest threat to the wildland urban interface is arborvitae as one species of vegetation. Okay. And the reason I say that is because it produces firebrands and it threatens not only the home that it's next to, but it threatens the entire community. And something that's very important here, 70 to 90% of all homes that burn in the wildland urban interface are ignited by embers landing on or near a home. So if we can do the proper type of landscaping and do the maintenance around those homes, we can reduce that loss. And I think if we can reduce arborvitae, and I'm going to talk about some alternative plants to arborvitae. Just real quickly, I'm going to go through this and say, here is this guy's hand. All he did was move his hand to the left and press in a little bit. And so 90% of the arborvitae plant is dead material. So it produces a lot of flammable material. I think we all know that dead material burns a lot better than live material. And what it does, it produces a lot of firebrands, embers. Thousands and thousands of embers come off a arborvitae plant. Okay, so what can we do? We can look at alternatives to arborvitae, and we're going to talk about some native vegetation that is some alternatives to arborvitae. And we can look at the home ignition zone, and I'll talk about that here a little bit. And then we can talk about fire building with fire-resistant materials. Okay, so if we look at arborvitae and ask the question, I'm not going to spend too much time on this, but why do we have arborvitae there? We have every plant we have in our yard, we have an objective for. If it's a columbine, we probably have it there because it's a pretty plant. It's really pretty to look at. If we have arborvitae there, it's there for some reason. It's probably providing privacy. It may be a windbreak, shade, whatever. Different varieties and different objectives. And what is the cost of the various plants that we have out there? And how much effort does it take to maintain those plants so that we are comfortable living with them? So let's talk about some alternative shrubs, if you will. And again, it all depends what our objectives are of why we're having shrubs out there. Wild rose and serviceberry are two wonderful plants, if you will, that provide nice color and some pretty much season long, spring, summer, and not fall, but spring and summer, they can provide some great variety to our landscape. Elderberry and golden currant are another couple of plants that can, serve as, if you will, as breaks and what have you. So I'm going through here. Shrubby cinquefoil is another plant. It's a native. It's not extremely common around here, but it used to be. And spirea, okay, is another plant that can serve as a fuel break. It serves as a fuel break. These are very fire resistant shrubs, by the way, that can block the views, if you will, during the summer. Obviously, it's not an evergreen, so it doesn't do it during the winter. But in many cases, I'm not sure that's what we want during the winter. I'm not sure we want the shade, the privacy, and what have you. In many cases, we want sunshine during the winter to get to our home to provide uh, energy, uh, solar energy to our home. Okay, here's a couple of plants that are smaller. Oregon grape and kinnikinick. Kinnikinick obviously is well, maybe not obviously, but it only gets maybe 3 to 6 inches off the ground, and a very colorful plant that offers a good variety and it's an evergreen pretty much. And so, well, not quite that one. Red osier dogwood and mock orange are two wonderful plants that will grow in a variety of locations. Yeah, and you can form hedgerows with these, and similar to arborvitae by making a hedge, if you will, and again managing them to the height that you want to put them at. Now I'm going to talk just the last couple of minutes about how to manage some of the vegetation around our home. If we are able to do the types of things out here in landscape zone from 30 to 100 feet from our home, landscape zone 3, if we manage that to have low intensity fire in there, and then in zone 2, if we have an area that fire can't spread from one woody plant to another woody plant, we have a very, very high probability of withstanding even the worst types of fires, as long as we take things around the 5 feet from our home and have plants in there that are non-flammable. Okay. We can have some pretty nasty things, and I'll talk about the plants to put in there in that landscape zone 1 with 0 to 5 feet. So if we use ground covers and herbaceous and perennials, and herbaceous vines and turf grasses, the types of grasses that well, I didn't talk about turf grasses so much, but the grasses, then keeping them green in that 5 feet area from the home, we have a very good chance of protecting our home and not allowing it to burn, even during some of the nastiest wildfires. In landscape zones 2 and 3, that is from 5 feet on all the way out to 100 feet from our home, if we have shrubs that are well pruned and trees, deciduous trees, and have those away from our home, and then the adaptive grasses, the native grasses, excuse me, the blue bunch wheatgrass, and the different types of grasses that I'd mentioned before, we have a very good chance of keeping our home in a good condition. Now, I know I went through that very rapidly, but I wanted to talk here, just save some time, is a guy named Barry Commoner. He was an ecologist that ran around the United States here about 30 years ago, something like that. He came up with these 4 rules of ecology. And I think it's important to keep this in mind as we go through this climate changing condition and we're looking at native vegetation or even non-native vegetation. Is some of his 4 rules of ecology. He has summed up the entire ecological principles in these 4 rules, if you will, or laws of ecology. You can't do one thing. Everything is connected to everything else. That's like I was talking about. We tried to remove fire from a ponderosa pine dry ecosystem. Well, that doesn't work. What happens there? We get the Douglas fir coming in, and we have all kinds of problems that result from that. We have large wildfires that threaten homes, burn cities, and what have you. So we got to keep that in mind, that we have a lot of different things to keep. Everything goes somewhere. We can't just take something and throw it away and think it doesn't go anywhere. Is when we have something that's made of plastic and we dispose of it, think about it. I think we've all heard about the microplastics out in the ocean that the whales are getting into and all the different animals. Everything goes somewhere. And the third one is that there's no free lunch. If we try to do something and think we can get away with it for free, it doesn't work that way. If we do one thing, it's going to have an effect on something else. That we can't just go out and change our lawn to a Kentucky bluegrass and water it on a normal basis. Well, there's a cost to that. There's a cost. It's going to take a lot more water. It's going to take a lot more energy to mow that. And it's going to take lots of different things. So as we do things, that there's a cost to everything we do. If we want to take out sagebrush and turn it into a different ecosystem, we're going to lose a whole bunch of wildlife. 450 different species live in the sage steppe. And so if we remove the sagebrush, it's going to cost us something. Okay. And then the fourth and final one is nature knows best. Okay. So if we try to come up with an idea that, hey, I know a shortcut that we can do, we can, instead of going with a native species, let's go with another species, okay, and introduce non-native species. Well, it may be doing good for a while, and then all of a sudden, bang, we get one of those extreme weather conditions and the plant dies, okay? So those are four simple rules of ecology that I think explain very well. In fact, I know a person that wrote their master's thesis on this, me. So now I just open it to questions, and I see I'm right on time. So we got just a few minutes.
Nice job, Al. Right on time.
Yeah, so one question in right now is Jenny said she loves wild rose, but heard it can be hard to control in the garden. So any tips on controlling it?
Wild rose does expand my shoots, if you will. And there are several different species, native species that do that and become, you know, it is going to spread, okay, and there's not you pick an area that you can devote to that, and that's probably what you're going to do because I am not sure there's an effective way. Uh, I mean, you can go through a lot of energy, but it takes energy to do that. Just like the four laws I just talked about, that is one of the things. That's what it does. It does that naturally by spending out the shoots and runs those out, and that's how it expands itself. Anything else?
None, no other questions at this point. Here comes one. So Mary Pat asked about, says our mock orange was seriously attacked by meal flies in 2023. We sprayed in 2024. It looks like the rest got cut off.
Well, let me offer is whenever a plant is stressed, but most plants send out a smell. It's called a pheromone, and well, I won't get into that. Is when a plant is stressed, it's more susceptible to any type of insect that or damage, if you will, insect or disease or fungus or whatever. And so the thing to do is try to keep your plants as healthy as you can. Prune out the canes, keep them open, allow sunshine to get in there so that and you're not nice and tight like that. Get in there and cut some of those, well, the larger canes out, if you will, and keep it open so you got air and sunshine going in. And they really don't need much moisture at all. But if they're opened up and well maintained, you should oughta, okay? Should oughta have less problem. Anything else?
No. So I guess we can call it a night. And Al, thank you very much again, and everyone for joining us. We really appreciate it.
Okay,
Thanks so much, Al. Thanks everyone for joining us.
Okay. What I was just going to say, kind of in summary, was that I realize that there's not a lot we can do in the dry forest and the sage steppe, but we all own little pieces or manage or recreate in little areas, and we can do things. Little things mean a lot. So if we can take care of a 10 by 10 area and make it better for the next generation, that's a big deal. Okay. Each one of us does a little thing, becomes a magnificent, wonderful thing. Okay. So that's why I kind of presented that. And I'm sure a lot of us have not thought a lot about rehabbing the entire 600 million acres of sage steppe, but we can do little things. So anyway, I thank you very much for your attention.
Great point. Thanks. All right. Everyone have a good evening.